Joan of Arc was born in the obscure village of Domremy in northeastern France around 1412. Her father Jacques d'Arc was a tenant farmer, and her mother Isabelle Romay came from similar peasant stock. Nothing about Joan's early years suggested anything out of the ordinary except for one critical detail, her unwavering piety. By all accounts, she was unusually devout for a child, spending long hours in church whispering prayers that unnerved even the local priest. At a time when France was fractured by civil war and foreign occupation, Joan's inner world was filled with a stark dualism: sin and salvation, loyalty and betrayal, the temporal and the divine. The 100 Years' War had gutted France. By the time Joan was a teenager, the English controlled vast regions of the country, including Paris, while the French crown was reduced to a desperate stronghold in the south. The monarchy itself was in crisis. Charles VII had not been crowned largely due to English occupation of Reims, the traditional site of royal anointing. In this vacuum of legitimacy, rumors of divine intervention were not just welcome, they were weaponized. At the age of 13, Joan claimed to hear voices. She later identified them as those of Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret. These were not gentle whispers. They issued instructions. Joan was told she had been chosen by God to drive out the English and restore Charles VII to the throne. According to her later testimony, the visions were accompanied by intense light and at times physical sensations, details that disturbed her inquisitors years later who suspected hallucination or heresy. The idea of a peasant girl receiving military directives from celestial beings was by the standards of the 15th century dangerous but not entirely unheard of. In a deeply religious society, saints were thought to intervene in worldly affairs. What set Joan apart was her insistence on action. Most visionaries became mystics. Joan became a soldier. Getting to the court of Charles VII required layers of persuasion. Joan was just 16 when she left her village, having convinced a local nobleman to escort her to the Dauphin. Along the way, she donned male clothing and cut her hair short, a practical choice for safety on the road, but one that would later become central to her condemnation. At Chinon, Charles agreed to grant her an audience. According to some accounts, he disguised himself among his courtiers to test her divine insight. Joan is said to have picked him out immediately. The theologians at Poitiers were less easily swayed. Joan was examined at length by clerics who sought to trap her in contradictions. To their surprise, she answered with clarity and restraint. When asked if she believed she was in God's grace, a trick question meant to bait her into heresy, she replied, "If I am not, may God put me there, and if I am, may God so keep me." It was the response of someone who understood the stakes. Still, the court was divided. Some saw her as a useful tool, a symbol of divine support in a demoralized war. Others were uneasy about endorsing someone who blurred so many boundaries, gender, class, and orthodoxy. But France was desperate, and desperation invites risk. Charles eventually allowed Joan to join the army being sent to relieve the English siege of Orléans. Joan was not placed in command, but she had an outsized influence. Clad in white armor and carrying a banner, not a sword, she led from the front. Soldiers reported that her presence transformed morale. The English, on the other hand, were unnerved. Many believed she was a witch, a claim that would later be recycled in her trial. Her tactics were often bold to the point of recklessness, and her confidence unnerved her commanders. At one point, she insisted on storming a fortress on a Friday, a day traditionally avoided for battle. When warned, she reportedly said, "Have no fear. The soldiers will fight, and God will give the victory." The siege of Orléans was lifted in May 1429, less than a week after Joan's arrival. This moment became the cornerstone of her legend. For the first time in years, the French had a clear symbolic victory. Joan's fame exploded. Chroniclers noted that she never killed anyone, never drew her sword in violence. Her weapon was legitimacy, and in a war without a clear king, legitimacy was more powerful than steel. But behind the triumph was a detail often overlooked. Joan had been wounded. An arrow pierced her shoulder during one of the assaults, and she refused to withdraw. When her armor was removed, the wound was treated with boiling oil, a painful but common antiseptic of the time. She survived, but the scar became a mark of both sainthood and corporeality. Her bloodied, broken body contradicted her mythic aura. It also reminded everyone that this was no spirit in armor, but a teenage girl enduring brutalities, typically reserved for men. That paradox the divine messenger made of flesh would haunt every stage of her downfall. The lifting of the siege at Orléans had transformed Joan from a mystical curiosity into a national figurehead. But power in medieval France was ephemeral, and Joan's elevation brought with it suspicion, resentment, and strategic confusion. As 1429 progressed, she continued to accompany military campaigns under the banner of divine inspiration. However, her presence on the battlefield increasingly exposed the fault lines between traditional command structures and the unpredictable influence of a teenage girl who claimed to speak with saints. Joan's immediate goal after Orléans was the coronation of Charles VII. The political logic was sound. The Dauphin's legitimacy could not be cemented until he had been anointed at Reims, the traditional site of French coronations. Joan saw this as both a sacred and national imperative. But the road to Reims wound through enemy territory, and many royal advisors saw the campaign as suicidal. Joan disagreed. Her visions, she claimed, demanded it. As before, her religious rhetoric took precedence over conventional military reasoning, and once again she proved effective. The so-called coronation campaign became a stunning psychological offensive. Town after town opened its gates to Charles' army, cowed not only by the military threat, but by the potent symbol Joan had become. Reims itself surrendered without a fight. On July 17th, 1429, Charles VII was crowned in a ceremony soaked in ceremony and incense, with Joan standing nearby, banner in hand. One contemporary claimed she wept for joy. She was 17 years old. It was the apex of her influence, but also the beginning of its erosion. The English and their Burgundian allies were stunned but regrouping. Within the French court, Joan's miraculous aura began to feel inconvenient. With the coronation complete, many officials believed her usefulness had expired. Charles himself, ever cautious, began to distance himself from her battlefield zeal. Joan had pressed for an immediate march on Paris. Charles hesitated. The offensive stalled. Meanwhile, cracks in her support base widened. French generals and nobles grew frustrated with Joan's unorthodox tactics and her increasing authority. Her visions, once accepted as divine guidance, now drew whispers of instability. She had begun to prophesy not just outcomes, but dates, some of which failed to materialize. In a court saturated with both piety and politics, that was dangerous. A failed prophecy could be interpreted as delusion, or worse, heresy. Still, Joan remained in the field. In September 1429, she led an assault on Paris that ended in failure. She was wounded again, this time in the thigh by a crossbow bolt, and forced to retreat. Her enemies interpreted it as divine judgment. Her allies saw it as strategic recklessness. Either way, it deepened the narrative that Joan's star was fading. Her physical injuries now mirrored the damage to her credibility. It was during this period that more troubling patterns began to emerge. Joan often claimed that St. Catherine and St. Margaret dictated her actions. When questioned about why her military decisions failed to align with common sense or advice from commanders, she would respond that the voices know more than men. What had once been inspiring now sounded dangerously close to fanaticism. Some chroniclers noted that Joan's behavior had grown erratic. She reportedly refused to eat for extended periods, sometimes claiming it was penance. On occasion, she would fall into trances, speaking in hushed tones to invisible figures. While medieval society often romanticized religious ecstasy, the political implications for a woman leading armies were different. Any hint of instability could justify withdrawal of support, or worse, theological condemnation. Her insistence on wearing male clothing also continued. She justified it on the grounds of safety and divine instruction, but it violated deeply entrenched norms. In 15th century France, gender transgression was not merely a matter of cultural taboo. It was legally actionable under both ecclesiastical and secular law. Clothing in this case was not just cloth. It was ideology, and Joan wore hers like armor against the world, both literally and symbolically. In early 1430, Charles VII made a revealing decision. Rather than continue campaigning with Joan, he sent her to defend Compiègne, a town threatened by Burgundian forces. On paper, it was a military deployment. In practice, it looked suspiciously like exile. She had gone from leading assaults on major cities to fighting minor skirmishes on the margins. When her letters to the king asking for reinforcements went unanswered, the message was clear. She would go to Compiègne, but not with the blessings she once carried. Her army was small, supplies were limited, and the enemy was closing in. Perhaps the most disturbing detail from this period was how Joan continued to interpret setbacks as trials permitted by God. She did not waver in her belief that her mission was righteous, a trait her judges would later interpret as pride, even blasphemy. But those around her had fewer illusions. The once unquestionable Maid of Orléans had become a liability, a figure too volatile to control and too visible to ignore. Her capture was now not a question of if, but when. On May 23, 1430, Joan of Arc led a sortie to defend the town of Compiègne from encroaching Burgundian forces. It was a tactical gamble. The enemy had encircled the town, and the French forces under Joan's command were too small to confront them directly. She chose instead to attack a vulnerable position near the outer lines. Initially, it seemed the risk might pay off, but the tide turned quickly. Burgundian reinforcements arrived, and Joan's troops began to retreat toward the gates of the city. What happened next has been debated for centuries. As Joan and her men fled toward safety, the city gates closed behind them. Some claimed it was a defensive necessity to protect the town from infiltration. Others believed it was a betrayal, a deliberate act ordered by Compiègne's garrison to rid themselves of an inconvenient symbol. Regardless of the motive, the result was clear. Joan was left outside the walls, surrounded and captured. The Burgundians, allies of the English, recognized immediately what they had acquired. Joan was no ordinary prisoner of war. She was a political weapon. Within days, she was taken to the castle of Beaulieu and later moved to Beaurevoir, where she remained imprisoned for several months. During this period, a desperate attempt was made by her supporters to raise ransom money, as was customary under the chivalric code. But this was not an ordinary war. Joan was not a knight. She was a peasant girl claiming divine authority, and neither the English nor the Burgundians were bound by chivalric conventions when it came to her. The silence from Charles VII was particularly damning. Despite owing his coronation to her efforts, he made no serious attempt to secure her release. No ransom was offered. No diplomatic effort was pursued. Joan's public utility had run its course. Now she was an embarrassment, a reminder of divine authority in a court that preferred the politics of compromise. Eventually, the Burgundians negotiated a price. For 10,000 livres, Joan was sold to the English, who transferred her to Rouen, their administrative stronghold in occupied France. Here, the legal machinery of her destruction began in earnest. The trial was not to be a quick affair or a straightforward execution for military crimes. It would be an ecclesiastical inquisition carefully constructed, publicly recorded, and designed to unmake her saintliness from within. The choice of a church trial was deliberate. By executing Joan as a heretic, the English could undermine her entire campaign retroactively. If she had acted under divine instruction, then her victories were miraculous. But if she had acted under false visions or worse, demonic influence, then the coronation of Charles VII could be framed as illegitimate. The stakes were as much theological as they were political. Joan was imprisoned in a secular castle, not a convent, and her guards were male soldiers, a clear violation of canon law for a woman under ecclesiastical arrest. She was shackled at night, chained to a wooden beam in her cell, and watched constantly. According to eyewitnesses, her cell had no latrine, forcing her to relieve herself under the gaze of her captors. It was a form of humiliation designed to break down her resistance, both physical and spiritual. Despite this, she remained defiant. When informed that she would face a trial for heresy, she responded that she feared only the betrayal of her voices. She requested the presence of ecclesiastical representatives from the French side, a request denied. The trial would be conducted by pro-English clerics led by Pierre Cauchon, the Bishop of Beauvais, a man deeply invested in English authority and hostile to the French court. The first hearings began in February 1431. Joan was interrogated for hours at a time, without legal counsel. She was denied access to church services. The questions she faced were deliberately convoluted, blending theological trickery with political traps. When asked whether she believed God hated the English, she responded, "As for God's love or hate for the English, I do not know. But I know they will be driven out of France except those who die there." It was a careful answer, politically charged but theologically neutral. But not all of her replies were so cautious. On several occasions, Joan insisted that her voices came from God and that she trusted them more than the church. This placed her in direct opposition to ecclesiastical hierarchy, a dangerous position, especially for a lay person, and doubly so for a woman. Throughout the proceedings, her male dress remained a point of fixation. Her accusers returned to it again and again, not simply because it violated gender norms, but because it represented a symbolic rebellion against God's natural order as they saw it. Canon law explicitly forbade women from donning men's clothing, unless their lives depended on it. Joan maintained that she wore armor and male garb for protection, both spiritual and physical, but this justification was dismissed. One of the trial's more unsettling episodes involved a clandestine plan by English guards to provoke her into heresy. Several times she was denied food unless she submitted to specific questions. According to one account, guards threatened her with rape, a possibility made more real by her lack of female attendance. The trial court did not intervene. They simply observed. If Joan broke down or cursed her voices, it could be used as evidence, but she did not. Instead, she held firm. She refused to deny her visions even when promised leniency. When offered the sacraments, which she had been denied for months on the condition that she submit entirely to the Church's judgment, she refused again. Her words were chilling in their clarity. "If I were condemned, I would not repent. I did nothing wrong." This above all terrified her inquisitors. Joan was not just a heretic in their eyes, she was an unrepentant heretic, the most dangerous kind. The trial at Rouen entered its final phase in April 1431. By now, over a dozen sessions had been held, and Joan's resilience had astonished even her enemies. She remained unbroken under pressure, offering measured responses and refusing to retract her claims of divine guidance. But the English could not afford an ambiguous outcome. They needed a conviction. And so the inquisitors shifted their focus not to theology but to entrapment. At the heart of their plan was an idea as old as the Inquisition itself. If they could extract a formal confession under duress, then a public execution could be masked as justice. Joan, they knew, had not studied canon law. She had no defense counsel. Her trust lay entirely in her voices and in the belief that God would not abandon her. That conviction, however, was precisely what the court would exploit. The turning point came on May 24, 1431. Joan was taken to a scaffolding platform set up in the cemetery of the Church of Saint-Ouen, where a sermon was delivered in front of hundreds of spectators. It was not a religious address, but a performance orchestrated to pressure her into submission. After the sermon, she was shown the instruments of execution and told she would be burned alive unless she signed a formal abjuration, a document denying her visions and submitting to the authority of the Church. For the first time, Joan faltered. Faced with immediate death, she broke. Reports vary on exactly what was signed. Some claim she marked a document with a cross. Others say she placed her name under terms she could not fully read. But the result was the same: she agreed to wear female clothing and accept the Church's judgment. Her sentence was commuted to life in prison. The English were livid. They had wanted a clean execution, not a conditional imprisonment. Bishop Cauchon and his colleagues saw an opportunity slipping away, and so they turned to the final tactic in their arsenal, the trap of relapse. Under church law, a relapsed heretic, someone who confessed and then returned to the same sin, could be executed without appeal. The trap was brutal in its simplicity. Joan was placed in a cell under the guard of male soldiers once more, without the protection of a convent or the promised female attendance. She pleaded for transfer to a church prison. Her request was denied. Days later, she resumed wearing male clothing. Her explanation was simple: she was in danger. Her accusers ignored the rationale. Why did she resume male attire? The reasons are multiple and chilling. One source suggests her female clothing was stolen by guards, leaving her no choice. Another indicates that her male clothes had been placed in the cell intentionally, and she had no alternative when guards threatened her with sexual assault. It's also possible that Joan believed her submission had been a betrayal of her mission, and that wearing male clothes was a reassertion of divine obedience. Regardless of the cause, the court had what it needed. On May 28th, the tribunal reconvened. They declared Joan a relapsed heretic. Her fate was now sealed. On May 30, 1431, Joan was informed she would be executed that morning. According to the record, she asked for confession and to receive the Eucharist. Both were granted an extraordinary concession, since relapsed heretics were typically denied the sacraments. Her guards described her as weeping but composed. One English soldier later claimed that he wept watching her pray, not from guilt but from confusion. How could a condemned heretic speak with such grace? She was led through the streets of Rouen to the old marketplace, the Place du Vieux Marché. There, a stake had been erected atop a platform, surrounded by kindling barrels of pitch and bundles of faggots. The crowd numbered in the hundreds. Soldiers, townspeople, clerics, all had come to witness the destruction of the so-called maid. Her execution was carefully staged. Before mounting the platform, Joan asked for a cross. An English soldier fashioned a crude one from 2 sticks and handed it to her. She clutched it to her chest as she walked to the pyre. Another priest fetched the altar cross from a nearby church and held it aloft so that she could see it as she burned. Bound to the stake, Joan repeated the name of Jesus over and over. Witnesses reported that her cries intensified as the flames rose. But what remains most horrific is not simply that she was burned alive, but that she was burned 3 times. The first fire consumed her outer garments and flesh. But fearing rumors of escape or miracle that she had fled or ascended into heaven, the executioners raked the coals apart and exposed her body half-burned to the crowd. One chronicler noted that her intestines and heart had remained unburnt, fueling superstitious awe. English officials, terrified of martyrdom, ordered a second burning, specifically aimed at incinerating the internal organs. Still unsatisfied, they ordered a third ignition to reduce her remains entirely to ash. When the fire finally died, nothing recognizable remained. But even in death, Joan was not granted rest. Her ashes were collected and scattered into the Seine, a ritual erasure intended to leave no relic, no tomb, no trace. The English feared what a burial site might become: a shrine, a site of pilgrimage, a monument to resistance. By casting her into the river, they hoped to dissolve not only her body, but her legacy. It would not work. With Joan's ashes scattered into the Seine, her captors presumed the story had ended. Yet even in 1431, doubts lingered. Her death had been so brutal, so calculated, that it did not extinguish belief it provoked it. Among the very people who had gathered to witness the ritual erasure, something more troubling began to take root: the suspicion that they had just watched a holy woman die. The ecclesiastical court at Rouen had taken great care to record every stage of Joan's trial, but it was those records that would come to haunt them. The trial's illegitimacy, its stacked clergy, political motivations, and manipulative tactics became harder to obscure as time passed. And as the political tides shifted in France, those same documents would be used to unravel the English narrative. Charles VII, the man who had done nothing to save Joan, ultimately secured his kingdom. By 1453, the 100 Years' War effectively ended with English defeat. Freed from wartime dependency on English favor, the French crown now found reason to revisit the trial that had condemned the very woman who made Charles's coronation possible. In 1455, the Pope authorized a posthumous retrial of Joan's case, a rehabilitation process that would reveal the grotesque inner workings of her condemnation. The retrial hearings began in Paris and Rouen and extended over 2 years. Witnesses were summoned from across France, including clerics, soldiers, and villagers who had known Joan from Domremy. The testimony was damning. Many recalled how the original court denied Joan access to legal counsel, deprived her of sacraments, and subjected her to inhumane imprisonment. Some spoke of her forced confession under threat of fire. Others recalled her resolve and composure even as the flames closed in. Most striking was the admission by several witnesses that Joan had requested a church prison and been denied. That detail exposed the trial's deliberate violations of canon law. Under ecclesiastical rules, a female heretic was entitled to be guarded by women in a religious institution. Instead, Joan was held in a military cell, threatened with sexual assault, and denied contact with sympathetic clergy. Her clothing choices, the linchpin of her relapse conviction, had been manipulated by circumstance and fear. The retrial proceedings ultimately concluded that the original trial was corrupted by falsehood, iniquity, and contradiction to the laws of God and man. In 1456, Joan of Arc was formally exonerated. Her name was cleared. Her judges were condemned. Her execution was ruled unjust and heretical in itself. But while the retrial restored her reputation, it could not undo what had been done to her body. And that is where perhaps the most disturbing detail of all resides in the physical fate of Joan's remains. The executioners had gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure no relic survived. But whispers persisted that a piece of her heart had resisted the flames, refusing to burn even in the third fire. According to one chronicler, the executioner himself was so shaken by this that he confessed to a priest in private, asking whether he had committed a mortal sin. When told he had, he reportedly fled Rouen. There were other unsettling fragments tales that bystanders had collected ash from the marketplace, that soldiers had taken scorched debris as keepsakes, that some had nightmares for months. None of these details can be verified, but their persistence reflects the psychological toll of her death. What had been intended as a spectacle of control had instead become a site of rupture. The Place du Vieux Marché, once a mundane commercial space, was stained by what many came to see as a judicial murder. It would remain an unmarked place of quiet dread for generations. Yet even amid the silence, a myth was growing. Joan had died at 19. She had never renounced her visions. She had withstood hunger, injury, isolation, and fire. She had wept, yes, but she had not begged. She had called out to Christ as her skin blackened. She had asked for a cross, and she had forgiven her captors. Her image began to shift from that of a dangerous heretic to a model of martyrdom. By the early 16th century, local cults venerating her had formed especially in Lorraine. Artworks began to depict her not in chains, but in radiant armor or in pastoral innocence. Her voices were no longer mocked, they were revered. Her trial transcripts, once used to justify her death, now served as the basis for sanctification. Still, her canonization would not come quickly. The Catholic Church moved slowly and cautiously, particularly when political implications remained. It wasn't until 1909, nearly 500 years after her execution, that Joan of Arc was beatified by Pope Pius VI. Her canonization followed in 1920 under Pope Benedict XVI. By then, Joan had become more than a saint. She was a national symbol invoked by monarchists and Republicans alike, by feminists and traditionalists, by generals and pacifists. Her image was co-opted by political movements across Europe. Statues of her appeared in town squares, military barracks, and churches. Yet each one silently ignored the trauma of her death, the manipulation, the coercion, the triple burning of a teenage girl. Modern biographers and historians have tried to excavate the full horror of Joan's execution, not just the pyre, but the process that led her there. What emerges is not simply a story of injustice, but of structural violence, of a church that used spiritual authority as a weapon, of a monarchy that abandoned its savior, and of a foreign power that destroyed a girl to unmake a myth. But if they had hoped to erase her, they failed. In the centuries that followed, Joan of Arc would be reborn, not despite her execution, but because of it. The site of Joan's execution was quiet again. The charred wood had long since been removed, the ashes dispersed, and the onlookers dispersed. But within the walls of Rouen Castle, the records of the trial remained meticulously copied, authenticated, and sealed. To her inquisitors, those documents were insurance. A heretic burned publicly could become a martyr privately, but if the record showed due process, then the church and the English crown could claim righteousness. What those same records inadvertently preserved, however, was a psychological profile of both the victim and her tormentors. Page after page reveals a systematic effort to break Joan through spiritual assault, not merely through accusation or confinement, but by attacking her mind. The trial was a prolonged act of mental violence. Joan was kept under near constant surveillance by English guards, who were not trained in ecclesiastical conduct and were openly hostile. Clerical observers recorded that she was taunted daily and subjected to crude gestures and threats. When asked why she would not abandon her male dress even after her first abjuration, she told them plainly, "It is more lawful and suitable to wear man's clothing being among men than to wear a woman's dress." This was not merely about cloth. Joan was not refusing femininity out of rebellion. She was protecting herself. Male clothing included pants, which made it easier to strap armor and to avoid rape. In the brutal ecosystem of 15th century warfare and prison life, the distinction was not symbolic. It was survival. The judges, however, treated her persistence as spiritual arrogance. Pierre Cochon, who orchestrated much of the trial, made repeated notes in the margins of testimony, highlighting her defiance. He framed her commitment to her voices as obstinacy. But what unsettled him most, according to the records, was her consistency. Across dozens of interrogations conducted over 3 months, Joan never altered the core of her account. The voices were divine, they had never misled her. and her mission had been righteous. Cauchon was no fool. He recognized that Joan's confidence posed a greater threat than her visions. If she broke under pressure, the church could present her as deceived or hysterical, but she did not. And so her accusers changed the nature of the trial itself. No longer was it a question of her orthodoxy, it became a test of obedience. Not to God, but to them. The psychological toll was immense. At one point, Joan became so distraught that she attempted an escape. In November 1430, while still imprisoned by the Burgundians prior to her sale to the English, she had thrown herself from the window of the tower at Beaurevoir, a 70-foot drop. She survived the fall miraculously with serious but non-lethal injuries. She later said she had feared being handed to the English and would rather die than fall into their hands. Her survival only reinforced in her mind the righteousness of her mission. To the English, it confirmed suspicions of witchcraft. By the time of her second imprisonment in Rouen, that escape attempt was used against her. The judges cited it as proof of desperation and guilt. Her hallucinations, they argued, had led her to reject divine grace and embrace suicide, a mortal sin. Joan countered weakly but consistently that she had jumped not to die but to escape. Her logic was that of a soldier under threat, not of a penitent. One of the most disturbing aspects of the trial comes from an episode in which Joan was shown a letter purportedly from the King of France claiming to support her. She wept upon reading it, likely recognizing it as a forgery. The judges recorded this reaction carefully. They seemed to hope that her sorrow might soften her, further break her emotional armor. It did not. The court continued to withhold the sacraments, a spiritual starvation meant to coerce compliance. For a medieval Catholic, denial of confession and communion was not a bureaucratic punishment, it was an existential terror. It meant exclusion from the body of Christ and implicitly damnation. Yet Joan held her ground. When offered the Eucharist in exchange for complete recantation, she refused. "If I am in sin," she said, "God will forgive me. If not, I do not need your pardon." She remained adamant on one other point: she had never commanded her army to kill anyone. She had led them into battle, yes, but she bore no sword with which to strike. Her weapon was the banner. The court found this simultaneously admirable and dangerous. It meant that Joan's power was symbolic and therefore harder to dismantle. An execution would not silence a girl whose strength came from perception. As the trial drew toward its end, the judges pushed harder. On May 29th, the final vote was taken. Joan was a relapsed heretic. Her previous abjuration had been deemed invalid due to her return to male dress and continued insistence on her voices. With legal justification now secured, the execution order was signed. Before dawn on May 30th, a priest came to hear her final confession. Reports indicate that Joan asked repeatedly for a cross to hold. Not a relic, not a ceremonial icon, just a cross. One was fashioned from 2 bits of wood. Another was brought from the church of Saint-Sauveur and held aloft, so she could fix her eyes on it as she burned. There is no reason to believe these details were fabricated. They were witnessed by English soldiers, friars, and townspeople, many of whom testified to them years later at the retrial. But perhaps the most revealing psychological moment came as Joan mounted the execution platform. According to multiple observers, she asked for the forgiveness of her enemies. She asked the priest to pray for her. She repeated the name of Christ as the flames rose. And then, as the executioners raked apart the embers to reveal her half-burned corpse, the crowd reportedly recoiled. Not because of horror, but because they realized something had gone wrong. The execution, intended as a final chapter, had written a beginning instead. Joan of Arc's execution was meant to close a chapter. Instead, it opened a wound. The moment her charred body was exposed, blackened, broken, unmistakably human. Something in the crowd shifted. Eyewitnesses, including English soldiers and French townspeople, would later describe it not as a victory for justice, but as a spectacle of spiritual dissonance. According to one friar who was present, the English were afraid even as she died. They had silenced her voice, but they could not control how it echoed. The immediate aftermath of Joan's burning revealed the unintended consequences of such brutality. Word of the triple burning spread quickly. The effort to eliminate any trace of her body, especially the grisly decision to burn her intestines and heart, separately raised questions among even her enemies. Why such thorough destruction? Why not a simple execution like the many others carried out during the Inquisition? The answer was clear to those who knew her story: fear. The English feared martyrdom more than heresy. The Place du Vieux Marché where she was burned did not become a shrine because it was not allowed to. Armed patrols discouraged gatherings. Public discussion of the execution was suppressed. And yet whispers spread. Joan's name was spoken quietly in parishes and letters in marketplaces. Some claimed to have seen a dove fly up from the flames as she died, a symbol of her soul ascending. Others reported that the executioner confessed to a priest that her heart had refused to burn. These accounts were dismissed as legend, yet they refused to die. It was not just the common people who began to question the legitimacy of her death. Some of her former enemies, including Jean Tressart, an officer of the English crown, admitted years later that they had burned a saint. The psychological weight of having participated in the destruction of someone perceived as divinely inspired lingered, especially as English fortunes in France began to falter. This period of reflection and doubt unfolded alongside shifting military and political tides. In the years following Joan's death, the English position in France began to deteriorate rapidly. Key cities were lost. French morale surged. Charles VII, having secured his crown, thanks in part to Joan, finally consolidated his control over the realm. While he made no immediate move to vindicate her, he did allow and eventually authorize the posthumous retrial that would come 2 decades later. The need for political stability had been greater in 1431. By the 1450s, the need to sanctify the past had taken precedence. But even before her rehabilitation, Joan's memory lingered in unsettling ways. In Domremy, her childhood village locals continued to tell stories about her kindness, her devotions, and her otherworldly calm. Some said the voices returned not to Joan, but to others. Claims of apparitions were never officially recognized, but the atmosphere of sanctity clung to the places she had touched. Among the most disturbing threads left hanging from her death was the church's role. Though her trial was ecclesiastical in nature, the clerics who presided over it operated under the shadow of political pressure. The bishop who had condemned her, Pierre Cochon, died disgraced before her retrial could commence. But many of the priests and monks who had watched silently or enabled the judicial machinery to run its course remained in their posts for years. The institution, not the individuals, bore the guilt. This guilt was compounded by the way the church had treated Joan not as a spiritual subject, but as a political object. Her visions, which might have been celebrated in another era or another context, were interpreted through the lens of threat. She was not interrogated as a mystic, but as a subversive. Her spirituality was not examined, it was dismantled. Her gender, her class, and her political impact made her dangerous in ways no man of her time could have been. The trial was not simply about orthodoxy, it was about obedience, about fear of a world where divine authority could bypass ecclesiastical hierarchy. The mechanics of her death reflected this deeper anxiety. The triple burning was not a legal requirement, it was an act of erasure. The scattering of her ashes into the Seine was not a tradition, it was an attempt to destroy the very possibility of memory. But neither worked. Instead, they added new layers to the horror of her end. Joan's body, denied the dignity of burial, became a symbol of the violence the system had inflicted on truth itself. And in this context, the psychological intensity of Joan's execution takes on new meaning. It was not only her physical body that was consumed, it was the certainty of her captors. The more they tried to control her narrative through coercion, humiliation, fire, the more they revealed their own desperation. By the end, Joan was no longer just a girl who had heard voices. She had become a mirror. And what she reflected terrified those who held the torch. A century later, during the Protestant Reformation, Joan would again become a symbol, but now of institutional overreach, of the dangers of religious politicization. In the modern era, she would be invoked by feminists, nationalists, and theologians alike. But none of these later identities would be possible without the violence that had tried to prevent them. Joan's execution was meant to silence. Instead, it testified. By the time the retrial of Joan of Arc was concluded in 1456, France had changed, and so had the memory of its most tragic saint. No longer vilified, Joan had become something more dangerous to the powers that tried to erase her. She had become undeniable. The retrial's final decree, read aloud at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, declared the original proceedings null and void. It condemned Bishop Pierre Cochon and his collaborators for errors, bias, and subversion of justice. Joan was now officially recognized as innocent, and by implication as a martyr. But exoneration came too late for the girl who had been burned at the age of 19. The ruling could not undo the threefold fire. It could not reassemble the body scattered into the Seine, nor could it give voice again to the witness who never recanted. It was at best a moral reckoning, a belated acknowledgement that the line between ecclesiastical authority and political manipulation had been crossed with devastating finality. For decades afterward, Joan remained a symbol, complicated, contested, and remarkably versatile. Royalists celebrated her as the rightful protector of monarchy. Catholics venerated her courage and divine inspiration. In rural France, peasants invoked her memory as proof that God could raise up even the lowliest to confront kings and bishops. But beneath every invocation was a darker truth: she had been murdered by the very institutions that now claimed her. The shadow of that hypocrisy never fully faded. Even in the 19th century, when Joan's canonization cause was revived in earnest, there remained debates over how to frame her legacy. Was she a saint because she suffered, or because she obeyed? Was her military leadership to be celebrated, or quietly brushed aside in favor of her piety? By the time Pope Benedict XV canonized her in 1920, the Church had reframed her story as one of faith, purity, and martyrdom. But this narrative, while reverent, carefully sanitized the more grotesque elements of her death. The trial's psychological torture, the strategic deprivation, the raw spectacle of her execution, these were rarely emphasized, yet they remained embedded in the source material, waiting for careful readers to unearth. Historians who returned to the trial transcripts in the 20th and 21st centuries found not a one-dimensional heroine, but a young woman of staggering clarity and resilience. Joan had no theological training, no political advisors, no written strategy. She faced dozens of trained clerics armed with precedent and power, and responded with sharp intelligence and unwavering conviction. Her words, preserved by those who sought to condemn her, remain some of the clearest windows into the mental resilience of a medieval mind under siege. The grotesque intensity of her final hours, the forced public recantation, the return to male clothing under duress, the burning and reburning of her remains, offer more than sensational detail. They reveal the extent to which institutions will go to preserve their own legitimacy. Joan's death was not just a punishment, it was a message. A message that was meant to say divine inspiration belongs to the powerful. Step outside that order and you will be annihilated. Yet that message failed, and its failure is the reason her name endures. Today, memorials to Joan of Arc stand in places where in her lifetime she would have been unwelcome. In Rouen, a modern church now rises over the site of her death, adorned with stained glass and a plaque declaring her a martyr. In Domremy, the house where she was born, is a national monument. In France's national consciousness, she occupies a space both sacred and subversive, venerated, but never quite tamed. What makes her execution so horrifying is not just the fire or the ritual destruction, or even the silence of those who abandoned her. It is the knowledge that Joan of Arc was destroyed, not because she failed, but because she succeeded. She had done what the clergy could not restore: national morale. She had done what the generals could not win battles. She had done what the king himself would not take risks, and for that she had to die. The flames that consumed her in 1431 were intended to erase a political problem, but they lit a fuse that would burn for centuries. Joan of Arc's story is often remembered through symbols: a sword, a banner, a burning stake. But behind those emblems lies a sequence of decisions, calculated, political, and cruel, that led to one of the most disturbing executions in medieval history. She was not simply killed, she was unmade. Her reputation, her body, and even her ashes were targeted with the precision of an institution terrified by her impact. Her death was not a failure of faith, but a failure of power. The Church could not tolerate a peasant girl who claimed divine instruction without clerical mediation. The monarchy abandoned her once her usefulness waned, and the English, desperate to delegitimize their French enemy, made her an example. Each of these forces converged to destroy her, not because she was wrong, but because she had been right in the wrong way. Yet history did not obey the script they had written. The records they kept to prove her guilt became the evidence of her innocence. The fire they used to destroy her image created a martyr, and the silence they tried to impose was broken by generations of witnesses, clerics, and ordinary people who refused to forget what they saw. Joan's legacy now stands at the intersection of faith and fear, nationalism and gender obedience and resistance. She is remembered not only for what she believed, but for what was done to her because of that belief. Her execution remains horrific, not just for its brutality, but for what it reveals about the fragility of institutions that claim to speak for truth and the cost of defying them. She died in fire, but she left behind a record no fire could destroy.